The lawyer's voice droned through the sterile conference room as he read the will, but when he reached my name, I burst into laughter so loud it echoed off the mahogany walls. $1. My wealthy stepfather had left me exactly $1, while my stepsister inherited his entire empire. But what happened next would expose a conspiracy spanning 3 decades and reveal why the man I'd called family had spent years systematically destroying every trace of who I really was. Let us know in the comments where you're watching. If this resonated, don't miss out on subscribing because tomorrow I'm sharing something that will completely change how you think about this topic. My name is Rebecca Hamilton, though for most of my adult life, I believed it was Rebecca Ashford. I'm 42 years old, recently divorced, and until 3 weeks ago, I was working double shifts at Riverside Diner in the small town of Millfield Creek, barely making rent on my cramped apartment while my ex-husband lived comfortably with his new wife in the house we'd bought together. I'd spent the last 15 years believing I was exactly what everyone told me I was, the daughter of a drug addict who'd abandoned me at age 7, taken in by the generous heart of businessman Harrison Ashford after he married my desperate mother. Harrison was a pillar of Millfield Creek, owner of 3 successful car dealerships and half the commercial real estate downtown. Everyone respected him. Everyone praised his charity in taking on a troubled child and giving her opportunities she didn't deserve. For 35 years, I lived with the weight of gratitude I was expected to show for Harrison's sacrifice. He constantly reminded me that my biological father was unknown, probably another addict, and that my mother's poor choices had left me with nothing but bad genetics and worse prospects. He saved me from foster care, he said, given me his name, a roof over my head, and chances most kids like me never got. I believed every word. I believed I should be grateful when Harrison paid for basic necessities while his biological daughter, Candace, got designer clothes and private school tuition. I believed it when he explained that college wasn't for everyone, especially kids from broken homes who needed to learn work ethic instead of developing unrealistic expectations. I believed him when he said my mother's addiction problems meant I needed to prove myself twice as hard to overcome my genetic disadvantages. The pattern continued into my marriage. When I married Tom Hamilton at 22, Harrison walked me down the aisle with a speech about how proud he was that his charity case had found someone willing to overlook her background. When Tom and I struggled financially, Harrison offered loans with detailed payment plans and constant reminders about fiscal responsibility. When we divorced last year after Tom's affair, Harrison made sure everyone knew that children from broken homes often repeated their parents' patterns. Through it all, I accepted his version of my story. I was grateful for his sacrifices. I worked menial jobs, lived modestly, and never questioned why I didn't feel connected to the woman he described as my mother or why I had vague memories that didn't match his timeline of events. It was Tom's divorce lawyer, actually, who first planted seeds of doubt. During our asset division proceedings, attorney David Porter had asked about my family background for inheritance considerations. When I explained that I was adopted by Harrison after my mother's death, Porter frowned and made notes that seemed inconsistent with what I'd told him. "Rebecca," he'd said during our final meeting, "have you ever seen your mother's death certificate or your own adoption papers? For someone with Harrison Ashford's resources and legal connections, his adoption of you seems to have been handled very informally." The question caught me off guard. Why do I need to see those documents? Harrison had handled everything when I was young and grieving, but Tom's betrayal had taught me that people I trusted could lie about the most fundamental things, so Porter's suggestion nagged at me for months after the divorce was finalized. When Harrison died suddenly of a heart attack 6 weeks ago, I wasn't surprised to be excluded from the funeral arrangements. Candace made it clear that biological family would handle everything, though she graciously allowed me to attend the service. I sat in the back row of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, listening to speaker after speaker praise Harrison's generosity and civic contributions, including several mentions of his charitable work with disadvantaged children. The will reading was scheduled for today, 3 weeks after the funeral. I'd only been invited as a formality, Candace explained, Harrison had mentioned me in his will, but given my difficult relationship with money and responsibility, I shouldn't expect anything substantial. Maybe a small token to remember him by. I'd driven to the offices of Harrison, Blackstone and Associates in my 13-year-old Honda, wearing the only dress I owned that didn't have visible stains from the diner. The law firm occupied the top floor of Millfield Creek's only high-rise, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the town Harrison had essentially owned. Candace arrived in her Mercedes, wearing a black designer suit that probably cost more than I made in 3 months. She'd inherited her father's sharp features and business acumen, building her own marketing firm while living in the family mansion Harrison had bought when she turned 16. At 38, she was everything I'd never been allowed to become: educated, successful, and secure in her place in the world. "Rebecca," she said coolly as we took our seats in the conference room, "I know this might be emotional for you, but try to remember that Father's decisions were always based on what he thought was best for everyone involved." Attorney James Whitman, Harrison's longtime legal counsel, spread the will documents across the mahogany table with the reverence of someone handling sacred texts. At 65, Whitman had been part of Harrison's inner circle for decades, managing not just legal affairs, but serving as trusted advisor on family matters. The reading proceeded exactly as expected. The house, the businesses, the investment accounts, the real estate holdings, everything went to Candace, with detailed provisions ensuring she'd have legal control and management authority. Charitable donations to local organizations where Harrison had served on boards, generous bequests to longtime employees and business associates. Then Whitman reached my name. To Rebecca Hamilton, formerly known as Rebecca Ashford, I leave the sum of $1, acknowledging her presence in my household and absolving all parties of any further obligations or claims. That's when I laughed. The sound erupted from somewhere deep in my chest, a mixture of exhaustion, recognition, and bitter amusement. $1. After 35 years of being reminded how much I owed him, Harrison's final statement was that I was worth exactly $1. Candace shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Rebecca, please try to be respectful. Father always said—" But Whitman was continuing, and his next words cut through my laughter like a blade. "However," he said, consulting a second document, "I am also required by law to inform you that a separate estate matter has come to my attention. 3 weeks ago, we received correspondence from the law firm of Morrison, Fletcher and Associates in Denver, Colorado, regarding the estate of one Catherine Rose Pemberton." The room went silent. I'd never heard that name before. Miss Pemberton passed away 18 months ago, and her estate has been in probate while investigators attempted to locate her legal heirs. Based on documentation they've provided, they believe Rebecca Hamilton may be entitled to inheritance from the Pemberton estate. I stared at him. "I think there's been a mistake. I don't know anyone named Catherine Pemberton." Whitman consulted his notes again. According to their research, Catherine Rose Pemberton was born Catherine Rose Hamilton in 1952. She would have been your biological mother. That's impossible. My mother's name was Linda Hamilton. She died of a drug overdose when I was 7. "Rebecca," Whitman said gently, "there's no death certificate on file for anyone named Linda Hamilton matching your mother's description. However, there are birth records indicating that Catherine Rose Hamilton gave birth to a daughter named Rebecca Rose Hamilton in 1982. Candace was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not contempt or condescension, but something that looked almost like fear. The Colorado attorneys have requested a meeting to discuss the Pemberton estate. According to their preliminary research, Miss Pemberton was the successful businesswoman who owned significant real estate investments in Colorado and Wyoming. Her estate is valued at approximately $4.2 million. $4.2 million. I was still processing the name Catherine Rose Pemberton when the number hit me. The woman Harrison claimed was my drug-addicted mother, the woman whose poor choices he'd spent decades using to justify my second-class treatment, had apparently been a successful businesswoman worth millions of dollars.
That's when I realized Candace hadn't said a word since Whitman mentioned Catherine Rose Pemberton's name. She was sitting perfectly still, her face pale, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. "Candace," I said slowly, "do you know something about this?" She looked at Whitman, then back at me. Father never mentioned anyone named Catherine Pemberton, but her voice carried the same tone I'd heard in my ex-husband's denials just before I discovered his affair. The careful neutrality of someone who knows they're lying and hopes they won't be caught. Whitman handed me a business card. "The Colorado attorneys are expecting your call, Rebecca. Given the complexity of the situation, I would recommend contacting them as soon as possible." As I left the law office that afternoon, clutching a business card that might connect me to a mother I'd never known and an inheritance that dwarfed everything Harrison had built, I realized that my stepfather's final insult might have accidentally revealed the biggest secret of my life. $1. He'd given me $1, thinking it was the last word in our relationship. But if Catherine Rose Pemberton was really my mother, then Harrison's last act of cruelty had just handed me the key to discovering who I really was. And based on Candace's reaction, I had a feeling that discovery was going to change everything I thought I knew about the family that raised me. If you're loving what you're hearing, smash that subscribe button. It really keeps us going. All right, let's jump back in.
I called Morrison Fletcher and Associates from my car in the law firm's parking lot, my hands shaking as I dialed the number on the business card. After 35 years of believing I was the daughter of a drug addict named Linda Hamilton, I was about to speak with lawyers who claimed my real mother was a successful businesswoman named Catherine Rose Pemberton. The receptionist connected me to Patricia Morrison, senior partner, who had been handling Catherine's estate. Her voice was warm but professional as she explained the situation that would turn my world upside down. "Miss Hamilton," she said, "we've been searching for Catherine's heir for 18 months. She passed away from cancer in March 2023, and her will specifically mentions a daughter named Rebecca Rose Hamilton, born in 1982 in Millfield Creek, Colorado." "But I was born in Millfield Creek, Kansas," I corrected. There was a pause. "According to our records, Catherine lived in Millfield Creek, Colorado until 1989. She moved to Wyoming afterward and built a successful property management business. Are you certain about your birthplace?" I realized I'd never actually seen my birth certificate. Harrison had always handled official documents, claiming he was protecting me from the painful details of my origins. I've always been told Kansas, but I've never seen the actual paperwork. "Miss Hamilton, I think we need to meet in person. There are some concerning discrepancies in the information you've been given about your background. Would you be able to come to Denver this week?" The urgency in her voice made my stomach drop. "What kind of discrepancies?" "The kind that suggest someone may have deliberately hidden your connection to Catherine Pemberton, someone who had very specific reasons for wanting you to believe your mother was dead." I booked a flight to Denver for the next morning using the emergency credit card I'd been saving for actual emergencies. This qualified. As I drove home to my tiny apartment, my mind raced with questions I'd never thought to ask. Why had I never seen my birth certificate? Why were there no photos of my supposed mother, Linda? Why did Harrison always change the subject when I asked about my early childhood? The flight to Denver gave me 3 hours to think, and by the time we landed, I was beginning to remember fragments that didn't fit Harrison's version of my story. Vague memories of mountains, not the flat plains of Kansas. A woman with dark hair who sang while she cooked, not the drug addict Harrison described. A house with big windows and a view, not the squalid apartment he claimed we'd lived in. Morrison, Fletcher and Associates occupied 2 floors of a gleaming downtown tower. Patricia Morrison was a sharp-featured woman in her 50s who greeted me with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for important clients. She led me into a conference room where boxes of documents covered a long table. "Rebecca," she began, "before we discuss the inheritance,
I need to show you what we've discovered about your background. Some of this may be difficult to process." She opened the first box and pulled out a birth certificate. Rebecca Rose Hamilton, born October 15, 1982, in Millfield Creek, Colorado. Mother, Catherine Rose Hamilton. Father, Michael James Hamilton. "My father's name was Michael?" I whispered. Harrison had always claimed my father was unknown. "Your parents were married for 3 years before your birth. Michael was killed in a construction accident when you were 2 years old. Catherine raised you alone until she disappeared in 1989. Disappeared? Patricia opened a second box filled with police reports and missing person files. Catherine Pemberton filed a report with Millfield Creek Police in September 1989. She claimed that her 7-year-old daughter had been kidnapped during a custody dispute with her deceased husband's family. The room was spinning. Custody dispute? According to these files, Catherine had been fighting Harrison Ashford in court for over a year. Harrison claimed that as Michael's stepfather and business partner, he had rights to you after Michael's death. Catherine maintained that Harrison had no legal standing since he wasn't your biological grandfather and had never formally adopted Michael. She spread court documents across the table. Custody petitions, restraining orders, and legal briefs painted a picture of an escalating battle between my mother and Harrison. Catherine's lawyer had argued that Harrison was using his wealth and connections to manipulate the legal system. Harrison's attorney claimed Catherine was an unfit mother whose grief had made her unstable. "What happened?" I asked, though I was beginning to guess. "On September 12, 1989, you disappeared from Catherine's home while she was at work. The babysitter, a teenager named Jenny Mills, told police that a man claiming to be your grandfather had picked you up for a family emergency. When Catherine came home and found you gone, she immediately suspected Harrison." Patricia handed me a police report written in Catherine's own handwriting. My throat tightened as I read my mother's desperate account of rushing to Harrison's house only to be told by his lawyer that he knew nothing about my whereabouts. She'd searched for weeks, hiring private investigators and pleading with authorities, but Harrison's influence in the community made it impossible to get proper help.
"She never stopped looking for you," Patricia continued. "Even after she moved to Wyoming and changed her name to Pemberton to escape the harassment, she hired investigators every few years. The last report in her files is from 2018. My mother had been looking for me just 4 years ago, while I was struggling through my marriage, completely unaware she existed. Why did she change her name to Pemberton? Harrison used his connections to make her life impossible in Colorado. He had her fired from her job, spread rumors about her mental state, and even had her investigated by Child Services on false allegations. She finally moved to Wyoming and started over with her grandmother's maiden name. I thought about the woman Harrison had described to me for 35 years, the drug addict who'd abandoned me, the irresponsible mother whose poor choices had left me with nothing. It was all lies. Patricia opened the third box, and I gasped. Inside were hundreds of photographs, report cards, artwork, and documents that Catherine had apparently saved from my first 7 years of life. Pictures of a little girl who looked exactly like me, living in a beautiful house in the mountains, surrounded by evidence of a mother's love. "She kept everything," Patricia said softly. "Your first drawing, your kindergarten graduation program, the tooth fairy letters she wrote you. After you disappeared, these were all she had left." I picked up a photograph of myself at age 5, sitting on a woman's lap in front of a Christmas tree. The woman had my eyes and my smile, and she was looking at me with the kind of pure love I'd spent my entire adult life searching for. "This is my mother," I whispered. Catherine was a successful businesswoman, Rebecca. After moving to Wyoming, she built Pemberton Property Management from nothing. She owned residential complexes in 3 states and had a reputation for fair dealing and community involvement. She was nothing like the woman Harrison described to you. The cruelest revelation was yet to come. Patricia handed me a thick folder labeled Legal Actions 1990 to 2010.
Catherine never gave up trying to find you through legal channels. She filed appeals, hired new lawyers, and even tried to have Harrison investigated for kidnapping. But his influence was too strong, and without direct evidence of your location, her legal options were limited. I opened the folder and found letter after letter from attorneys explaining why Catherine's case couldn't proceed. Jurisdictional issues, lack of evidence, procedural obstacles. The legal system that should have protected a mother's right to her child had instead been used to keep us apart. In 2003, she received information suggesting you were living in Kansas under the name Rebecca Ashford. She immediately hired a private investigator to confirm your identity and welfare. My hands froze on the papers. She found me in 2003? The investigator confirmed you were alive and apparently well cared for. Catherine wanted to approach you directly, but her attorney advised against it. You were 21, legally an adult, but you'd been told she was dead for 14 years. The lawyer worried that sudden contact might be traumatic or that Harrison might retaliate against you. I thought about 2003. I'd been working at a grocery store, dating Tom, trying to figure out my place in the world. My mother had been alive, living just 2 states away, desperate to reconnect, but afraid of hurting me. She decided to wait and hope that you would eventually search for information about your origins. She left detailed instructions with her lawyers to find you immediately if anything happened to her. Patricia handed me the final document, Catherine's will. The language was simple and heartbreaking. To my daughter, Rebecca Rose Hamilton, whom I have loved and searched for every day since she was taken from me, I leave everything I have built. I pray that by the time you read this, you will understand that I never stopped fighting to bring you home. The inheritance wasn't just money and property. It was 34 years of a mother's love, preserved and waiting for me to claim it. But as I sat in that Denver conference room, surrounded by evidence of the life that had been stolen from me, one question dominated my thoughts. How had Harrison managed to keep this secret for so long? How had he convinced an entire community that he'd rescued me from a drug addict when my real mother had been fighting desperately to get me back? Patricia seemed to read my mind. Rebecca, there's something else you need to know. Catherine's investigative files suggest that Harrison didn't act alone. She believed there was a network of people in Kansas who helped him maintain the deception about your identity. What kind of network? People who would have needed to see official documents, process legal paperwork, or verify your background over the years. School administrators, court clerks, social workers. Someone made sure that anyone who might have questioned your story never got the chance to dig deeper.
I thought about Millfield Creek, Kansas, and all the people who'd known me my entire life. How many of them had been part of keeping me from my real mother? How many had watched me struggle and work menial jobs while knowing I had family who loved me? There's more, Patricia said grimly. Catherine's files indicate that Harrison may have used similar methods to separate other children from their families. You might not be his only victim. As I left the law office that afternoon, carrying copies of documents that proved my entire life had been built on lies, I realized that discovering Catherine's inheritance was just the beginning. I wasn't just entitled to $4.2 million. I was entitled to the truth about why Harrison Ashford had stolen a 7-year-old girl from her mother and spent 35 years making sure we never found each other. And based on Patricia's warnings about a network of accomplices, I had a feeling that truth was going to destroy more than just Harrison's memory. It was going to expose an entire community that had participated in the systematic theft of my identity and my mother's love. The investigation was just beginning, and I was no longer the grateful charity case Harrison had raised me to be. I was Catherine Pemberton's daughter, and I was going home to Kansas with questions that demanded answers. I returned to Millfield Creek with a briefcase full of evidence and a rental car instead of my beat-up Honda. The $4.2 million inheritance was still in probate, but Patricia Morrison had arranged for a substantial advance to cover immediate expenses. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't worried about making rent or buying groceries. Instead, I was focused on one thing: finding out exactly who had helped Harrison Ashford steal 35 years of my life. My first stop was the Millfield Creek Public Library, where the town's records had been archived for over a century. The head librarian, Mrs. Dorothy Fernandez, had worked there for 43 years and remembered everyone who'd ever checked out a book or researched local history. She was exactly the kind of institutional memory I needed to access. When I walked through those familiar glass doors wearing a tailored business suit instead of my diner uniform, Mrs. Fernandez looked up from her desk with surprise. "Rebecca Ashford? My goodness, I heard you'd come into some money. How wonderful for you, dear." The speed with which news had traveled through town told me everything I needed to know about how quickly my investigation would become common knowledge. But that might work in my favor. If people were talking, someone might slip up. "Actually, it's Rebecca Hamilton now. I'm researching my family history, and I need to access birth records, school enrollment documents, and newspaper archives from the late 1980s. Mrs. Fernandez's expression shifted subtly. "Well, dear, some of those records require special permission to access. Perhaps you should speak with Mayor Bradley about what you're looking for." The deflection was telling. In a town this size, the librarian should have been eager to help with genealogy research. Instead, she was directing me to political authority. That suggested someone had given instructions about what information I should or shouldn't be able to access. "Mrs. Fernandez, I have documentation from Colorado attorneys proving that my birth certificate and school records contain errors that need to be corrected. I'm not looking for confidential information. I just need to verify basic facts about my own childhood." She hesitated, then disappeared into the archive room for nearly 20 minutes. When she returned, she carried only a thin folder containing my elementary school enrollment papers and report cards. "I'm sorry, dear, but the birth records from that time period seem to have been transferred to the county courthouse, and we don't have newspaper archives from 1989. Those were digitized, and the originals were discarded." I opened the enrollment folder and immediately found the first proof of the conspiracy. My kindergarten registration form, dated August 1987, listed my birthplace as Millfield Creek, Kansas, and my guardian as Harrison Ashford. But according to Catherine's documents, I hadn't even arrived in Kansas until September 1989. "Mrs. Fernandez, this enrollment form shows me starting school here in 1987, but I have evidence that I was living in Colorado until 1989. There's clearly been some kind of record-keeping error." Her face went pale. "Oh, my, that does seem unusual. Perhaps you should speak with Principal Martinez at the elementary school. She might have access to additional records." As I left the library, I realized that Mrs. Fernandez's nervous deflection wasn't just bureaucratic caution. She knew something was wrong with my records, and she'd been instructed not to help me discover what it was. Principal Carmen Martinez had been an assistant teacher when I was in elementary school, and she'd worked her way up through the district administration over the past 3 decades. She agreed to meet me in her office during the lunch hour, probably expecting a routine request for transcript copies. When I showed her the enrollment discrepancies and asked to see my complete academic file, her reaction confirmed that the cover-up extended deep into the school system. "Rebecca, I need to be honest with you. About 6 months after you started school here, we received instructions from the district superintendent to treat your records as confidential due to ongoing legal proceedings. All requests for information about your background were to be referred to Harrison Ashford's attorney." "What kind of legal proceedings?" "We were told there was a custody dispute involving questions about your legal guardianship. The district was advised not to release any information that might interfere with court procedures." I leaned forward. "Principal Martinez, custody disputes usually last months, not decades. Did anyone ever tell you those legal restrictions had been lifted?" She looked uncomfortable. "Not explicitly, but Mr. Ashford was on the school board for 15 years, and he regularly assured us that he was handling everything properly. We trusted his judgment." "Who else knew about these restrictions?" "The superintendent, the district records clerk, and probably the school nurses who handled your medical information. anyone who might have needed to access your files for official purposes. This was the systematic approach I'd expected to find. Harrison hadn't just forged a few documents and hoped for the best. He'd created institutional policies that prevented anyone from questioning my background, and he'd maintained those policies for decades through his position on the school board. I need to see my complete file, including any documentation about these legal restrictions. Principal Martinez disappeared into the records room for over an hour. When she returned, she looked shaken. "Rebecca, there are significant gaps in your file. Documents that should exist from your early elementary years are missing, and some of the remaining paperwork has been altered." She spread the contents of my academic file across her desk. What I saw was a masterpiece of systematic deception. Report cards with dates that didn't match the enrollment timeline, medical records with different handwriting styles suggesting multiple people had contributed to creating false documentation, and most damaging, a series of memos from Harrison's attorney instructing school personnel on how to handle questions about my background. One memo, dated 1991, was particularly revealing. All inquiries about Rebecca Ashford's family history should be referred immediately to this office. Under no circumstances should school personnel discuss her origins with outside parties, including law enforcement or social services. This child's welfare depends on maintaining confidentiality about her placement. Principal Martinez, this memo specifically mentions law enforcement and social services. That suggests someone was actively investigating my situation. She nodded grimly. I remember now. In 1990 or 1991, we had visitors from social services asking questions about you. They wanted to interview teachers about your adjustment and emotional state, but Harrison's lawyer contacted the district and had the investigation stopped. On what grounds? He claimed the investigators were operating outside their jurisdiction and that their inquiries were harassment designed to disrupt a stable placement. He provided documentation suggesting you were thriving in your current environment and that outside interference would be harmful to your development. I thought about my 7-year-old self, probably still mourning my mother and confused about why I'd been taken from the only home I'd known. Social services had tried to check on my welfare, but Harrison's legal maneuvering had prevented them from discovering the truth. My next stop was the county courthouse, where birth certificates, adoption records, and legal proceedings should have created an unalterable paper trail. County Clerk Angela Morrison had processed official documents for 28 years and would have handled any legitimate adoption or guardianship paperwork for my case. When I explained that I needed to verify my birth records and any adoption documentation, her reaction was immediate and telling. "Oh, honey, I remember your case. It was so unusual that it stuck with me all these years." Unusual how? Well, most adoptions or guardianship transfers involve months of paperwork, home studies, and court hearings. But your situation was handled as an emergency placement with minimal documentation. I always wondered if all the proper procedures had been followed. She pulled my file from the archives, and what I found was smoking gun evidence of legal fraud. The guardianship papers that gave Harrison custody of me were dated September 30th, 1989, just 18 days after my disappearance from Catherine's home. But the document claimed I had been living with Harrison for over 2 years due to the biological mother's incapacity. Ms. Morrison, this guardianship petition contains false information. It claims I'd been in Harrison's care since 1987, but I have proof I was living with my mother in Colorado until September 1989. She examined the documents with the eye of someone who'd processed thousands of similar papers. You're right. The timeline doesn't make sense. And look at this. The witness signatures were notarized by Harrison's business partner, Jerome Walsh. That's highly irregular.
Witness signatures should be notarized by someone without a financial relationship to the petitioner. This was the evidence I needed to prove criminal fraud. Harrison hadn't just taken me from my mother. He'd used the legal system to legitimize his kidnapping through fabricated court documents. Ms. Morrison, do you remember if there was any investigation into the authenticity of these documents? There was supposed to be. Judge Patricia Hawkins, who approved the guardianship, told me privately that she had concerns about the rushed timeline and limited evidence. She ordered a follow-up review scheduled for 6 months later. What happened to that review? Her expression darkened. Judge Patricia Hawkins died in a car accident in March 1990. Her replacement, Judge Robert Sterling, was a close friend of Harrison's family. When I asked about the scheduled review, Judge Sterling said it was no longer necessary since you appeared to be adjusting well to your placement.
The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. Harrison hadn't just manipulated documents and institutional policies. He'd benefited from the convenient death of the one judge who might have uncovered his fraud, and he'd ensured that her replacement was someone who wouldn't ask uncomfortable questions. My investigation was interrupted by an unexpected phone call. Tom, my ex-husband, was calling from a number I didn't recognize. "Rebecca, we need to talk. There are things about your divorce that you don't know. Things Harrison told me about your background that I now think were lies." We met that evening at a coffee shop on the outskirts of town, away from the curious ears that seemed to monitor every conversation in Millfield Creek. Tom looked haggard and nervous, clearly carrying guilt about information he'd withheld during our marriage. "Before I agreed to marry you, Harrison pulled me aside for what he called a father-son conversation. He told me there were things about your family history that I needed to understand if I was going to be your husband." My stomach dropped. "What did he tell you?" "He said your biological mother had been involved with dangerous people. Drug dealers, possibly organized crime. He claimed that's why you'd been placed in protective custody as a child, and why your identity needed to be kept confidential for your own safety." The manipulation was breathtaking. Harrison had convinced my husband that secrecy about my background was necessary to protect me, ensuring that Tom would never encourage me to research my origins or question the official story. He made me promise never to discuss your family history with you or anyone else. He said that even innocent questions about your childhood could potentially expose you to people who might want to hurt you. "Tom, why are you telling me this now?" His expression was filled with shame. "Because after the divorce, when I was cleaning out our storage unit, I found documents that Harrison had given me during our engagement, supposedly official papers proving your protective custody status. But now that I know about your inheritance and your real mother, I had those documents examined by a forensic expert." He handed me a manila envelope. Inside were the papers Harrison had used to convince my husband that I was essentially a witness protection case. The forensic analysis revealed that every document was a sophisticated forgery, created using letterhead stolen from legitimate government agencies. "Rebecca, our entire marriage was built on lies that Harrison fed me about who you were. When I had the affair, part of what drove me away was feeling like I was married to someone whose past was completely hidden from me. I thought you were keeping secrets, but now I realize you were being kept from the truth." As I drove home that night, I understood that I wasn't dealing with simple financial fraud or even kidnapping. Harrison had created an entire false reality around my identity, involving dozens of people across multiple institutions. He'd manipulated legal systems, educational records, and even my personal relationships to maintain control over my life. The conspiracy was far more extensive than I had imagined, but it was also more fragile than Harrison had realized. After 35 years, the lies were starting to unravel, and the people who'd helped maintain his deception were beginning to panic. Tomorrow, I would begin the most dangerous phase of my investigation, confronting the people who'd actively participated in stealing my life,
and demanding they explain why they'd chosen to protect Harrison Ashford instead of a kidnapped 7-year-old girl. The truth was finally within reach, but I was beginning to understand that some people would do anything to keep it buried. The breaking point came at 6:30 a.m. on a Tuesday, when I found my rental car's tires slashed and a note under the windshield wiper. Some secrets are buried for good reasons. Stop digging before you get hurt. The message was typed on plain paper with no signature, but the threat was clear enough. My investigation into Harrison's conspiracy had rattled the wrong people, and they were moving from passive resistance to active intimidation. I called Patricia Morrison in Denver and explained the escalating situation. Within 4 hours, she'd arranged for a private investigator named Marcus Chen to fly in from Colorado and assist with my safety while I continued gathering evidence. Marcus was a former Denver police detective who specialized in complex fraud cases, and his first piece of advice was exactly what I'd expected. Rebecca, whoever sent that threat is amateur hour, but that doesn't make them less dangerous. People who've spent decades protecting a secret tend to get desperate when that secret threatens to destroy their lives. We need to accelerate this investigation before they have time to organize something more serious. His plan was methodical and designed to create maximum pressure in minimum time. Instead of confronting suspects individually and giving them opportunity to coordinate their responses, we would hit multiple targets simultaneously, forcing them to react independently while we documented their panic. Our first coordinated strike began at 9 a.m. sharp. While Marcus visited Mayor Bradley to request official records about zoning permits for Harrison's businesses during the 1990s, I walked into Sterling & Associates, the law firm that had handled Harrison's legal affairs for 3 decades. Partner Jerome Walsh, now in his 70s, had been Harrison's closest business associate and the notary who'd witnessed the fraudulent guardianship papers.
Walsh's secretary tried to deflect me with appointments and procedures, but when I mentioned that I was there regarding Catherine Pemberton's estate and discrepancies in legal documents from 1989, Walsh himself appeared in the lobby within minutes. "Miss Hamilton," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "perhaps we should speak privately in my office." The office was a monument to legal respectability, with law books, framed diplomas, and photographs of Walsh with various community leaders spanning 4 decades. But when I placed copies of the guardianship papers on his desk and asked him to explain why he'd notarized documents containing false information, his composure cracked immediately. "Those documents were prepared based on information provided by Harrison Ashford," he said defensively. "As a notary, my responsibility was to verify signatures, not to investigate the accuracy of the content. Mr. Walsh, you notarized witness statements claiming I had lived with Harrison since 1987, but you also notarized business documents showing Harrison was in Colorado in September 1989, attempting to negotiate some kind of settlement with my mother. How do you reconcile those contradictory timelines?" His face went pale. I hadn't mentioned anything about business documents or Colorado negotiations, but his reaction confirmed that such documents existed and that he knew about them. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," he said, but his hands were shaking as he reached for his phone. "I think this conversation should include Harrison's current attorney and perhaps representatives from the estate. Mr. Walsh, Harrison is dead, and his estate has already been settled, but the Pemberton estate attorneys are very interested in understanding how fraudulent legal documents were created to prevent a kidnapped child from being returned to her mother." The word kidnapped hit him like a physical blow. For 35 years, he'd probably told himself that Harrison's actions were a legitimate custody arrangement, possibly even beneficial for me. The legal terminology forced him to confront the reality that he'd participated in a serious crime. "I want you to leave my office," he said, reaching for his phone again. "This conversation is over." But as I gathered my papers, I noticed him dialing a number from memory rather than looking it up in his contacts. Someone he called regularly, someone who needed to be warned immediately, but the Pemberton investigation was asking specific questions about Colorado business deals and contradictory legal documents. While I was pressuring Walsh, Marcus was having an equally productive conversation with Mayor Bradley. According to the text he sent me, Bradley had immediately started making phone calls when asked about building permits and zoning variances Harrison had received during the 1990s. Specifically, Marcus had asked about permits for Harrison's car dealerships and whether any of those permits had been expedited or approved despite incomplete documentation. Our coordinated approach was working. By applying pressure simultaneously to multiple participants in the conspiracy, we were forcing them to communicate with each other in ways that revealed the scope of their ongoing cooperation. The situation escalated dramatically when I arrived at my next target, Dr. Amanda Foster, who had been my pediatrician throughout my childhood and had processed the medical records that supported Harrison's guardianship petition. Dr. Foster was now retired, but she still maintained an office for consulting work, and she'd agreed to meet with me to discuss updating medical records for insurance purposes. When I walked into her office, I realized I'd walked into a trap. Dr. Foster was there, but so were 5 other people I recognized as key figures from Harrison's inner circle. Walsh sat in the corner, still looking shaken from our morning encounter. County Clerk Angela Morrison was there, along with former Superintendent Richard Hayes, who'd established the policies that kept my records confidential. The group was completed by 2 people I didn't immediately recognize, a woman in her 60s and a man who had the bearing of law enforcement. "Rebecca," Dr. Foster said, her voice carrying an authority I remembered from childhood checkups, "we need to talk." The woman I didn't recognize stood up and introduced herself. "I'm Sandra Walsh, Jerome's wife and former social services supervisor. This is Detective Roy Martinez, retired from the County Sheriff's Department. We've all been discussing your recent inquiries, and we think there are some things you need to understand." This was the coordinated response I'd been expecting. The co-conspirators were no longer trying to handle my investigation individually. They'd organized a group intervention designed to control the narrative and limit the damage to their reputations and legal exposure. "Understand what?" I asked, pulling out my phone to record the conversation. "Put that away," Detective Martinez said sharply. "This is a private conversation, and recording without consent is illegal in this state." Actually, Kansas is a one-party consent state, so I can record any conversation I'm a part of. But I'm curious why you're all so concerned about having your words documented. Sandra Walsh stepped forward with the kind of patronizing tone that probably worked on confused teenagers, but wouldn't work on a woman who had just inherited millions and hired investigators. "Rebecca, you've been asking questions about events that happened over 30 years ago, and you're drawing conclusions based on incomplete information. What you're calling kidnapping and fraud was actually a complicated family situation that was resolved in the best interests of everyone involved. Including my mother, who spent 34 years searching for me?" The room went silent. That detail hadn't been public knowledge in Millfield Creek, which meant they'd been investigating my investigation. They knew about Catherine's estate, the private investigators, and probably the Denver attorneys. Dr. Foster cleared her throat. "Your mother's situation was tragic, Rebecca, but she was dealing with significant mental health issues after your father's death. Harrison provided you with stability and opportunities that wouldn't have been available otherwise. Dr. Foster, do you have medical records documenting my mother's supposed mental health issues? Because the Colorado attorneys have her complete medical file, and there's no evidence of any psychiatric treatment or psychological problems." Another silence. Dr. Foster had clearly expected me to accept her claims without demanding documentation. Superintendent Hayes tried a different approach. "Rebecca, you've built a good life here. You have friends, community connections, a history in this town. Why risk destroying all of that by pursuing allegations that can never be proven and will only cause pain for everyone involved?" The threat was subtle but clear. If I continued my investigation, I would face social ostracism and community retaliation. The same people who'd helped Harrison maintain his conspiracy for 35 years would close ranks to protect themselves. "Because," I said, standing up with the confidence that comes from having both money and truth on your side, "my mother spent her entire adult life believing her daughter had been kidnapped and that the legal system had failed to protect us. She died without ever knowing that I was alive healthy, and desperate to find the family I'd been told didn't exist. No amount of community acceptance is worth preserving lies that caused that much pain. Detective Martinez leaned forward with the intimidation tactics he'd probably used in interrogation rooms for decades. Miss Hamilton, you're making serious allegations against respected community members based on documents that may have been misinterpreted or taken out of context. False accusations could result in defamation lawsuits that would consume any inheritance you think you're entitled to. But his threat revealed something important. He'd used the phrase, inheritance you think you're entitled to, suggesting that they believed they could still challenge my legal claim to Catherine's estate. That meant they thought they had information or documentation that could undermine my position. Detective Martinez, what makes you think I'm not entitled to inherit from my own mother? The question caught him off guard, and his response confirmed my suspicion. Well, there are questions about the legitimacy of the identification process. Just because someone in Colorado thinks you're Catherine Pemberton's daughter doesn't mean they've proven it conclusively. Sandra Walsh nodded in agreement. There are legal procedures for establishing identity in inheritance cases. Without proper documentation of your relationship to the deceased, any inheritance could be challenged by other potential heirs. This was their endgame strategy. If they couldn't silence my investigation through intimidation or social pressure, they planned to challenge my legal identity in probate court. They'd spent 35 years perfecting the documentation that supported my false identity as Rebecca Ashford, and they believed that documentation was stronger than the evidence Patricia Morrison had assembled in Colorado. Jerome Walsh spoke for the first time since I'd arrived. Rebecca, we're not your enemies. We're trying to protect you from a legal battle that could destroy your financial security and your reputation in this community. Sometimes it's better to accept the life you've built rather than chase after possibilities that might not work out the way you expect. The paternalistic manipulation was breathtaking. The same people who'd stolen my identity and kept me from my mother were now positioning themselves as protectors who wanted to save me from the consequences of discovering the truth. But their strategy contained a fatal flaw. By organizing this group intervention, they'd revealed the full scope of their ongoing conspiracy and their continued willingness to work together to suppress evidence. More importantly, they'd made specific threats about challenging my inheritance that would require them to produce documentation in court. Ladies and gentlemen, I said, gathering my things and preparing to leave, I appreciate your concern for my well-being, but I'm not interested in preserving a life that was built on lies. If you want to challenge my inheritance or my identity in court, you're welcome to try. But you should know that Catherine Pemberton's estate attorneys are already working with federal investigators who specialize in cases involving fraudulent guardianship and identity theft. The mention of federal investigators caused visible panic. County-level officials who'd thought they were dealing with a local probate dispute suddenly realized they might be facing federal criminal charges. As I walked out of Dr. Foster's office, I heard frantic conversations beginning behind me. Phone calls being made, urgent discussions about legal representation, and the kind of panicked planning that happens when people realize their decades-old conspiracy is about to be exposed to federal scrutiny. Marcus was waiting in the parking lot with news that confirmed my suspicions about the coordination between Harrison's co-conspirators. Rebecca, I intercepted radio communications between Detective Martinez and current law enforcement. He's been feeding information about your investigation to people who are actively working to undermine it. We're not just dealing with people who helped Harrison 35 years ago. We're dealing with people who are still actively covering up his crimes.
The confrontation had revealed the true scope of the conspiracy, but it had also escalated the danger. These weren't just guilty parties trying to avoid consequences for past actions. They were active participants in an ongoing criminal enterprise who were prepared to use intimidation, legal manipulation, and possibly violence to protect themselves. But their desperation had also given me exactly what I needed to destroy them completely. By threatening to challenge my inheritance and my identity in court, they'd opened a legal proceeding that would require them to produce all the documentation they'd used to support Harrison's fraud. And Patricia Morrison's investigators had already proven that every piece of that documentation was fabricated. The final battle was about to begin, and Harrison's co-conspirators had just handed me the weapons I needed to win it. The federal courthouse in Kansas City had never seen a case quite like United States v. Walsh et al. 17 defendants faced charges ranging from conspiracy to commit kidnapping to organized fraud, with evidence spanning 35 years and involving crimes across multiple states. The prosecution's case file contained over 3,000 documents, and the witness list included 47 people who'd been affected by what the FBI now classified as a systematic criminal organization that specialized in identity theft and fraudulent guardianship schemes. I sat in the front row of the gallery wearing a Navy business suit, with Patricia Morrison beside me and Marcus Chen behind us. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of depositions, evidence gathering, and coordination with federal investigators who discovered that Harrison Ashford's conspiracy was far more extensive than even I had imagined. FBI Special Agent Lisa Ramirez led the investigation with a methodical precision of someone who specialized in complex financial crimes. Her opening statement to the jury painted a picture that made my personal tragedy part of a much larger pattern of exploitation. Ladies and gentlemen, this case represents one of the most sophisticated and long-running criminal organizations we've encountered in family court fraud. The defendants didn't just steal one child from her mother. Over a period of 28 years, they systematically targeted wealthy widows and single mothers using legal manipulation and forged documentation to gain custody of children whose inheritances they could then control and steal. The evidence presentation took 4 weeks. Financial analysts traced money flows through dozens of shell companies and fake charitable organizations. Digital forensics experts presented evidence of systematic document forgery spanning 3 decades. But the most devastating testimony came from Dr. Sarah Kim, a Harvard-trained forensic psychiatrist who'd analyzed the psychological profiles the conspirators had created to justify their guardianship claims. The defendants created remarkably consistent psychological narratives to support their custody petitions, Dr. Kim testified. In every case, the biological mothers were portrayed as mentally unstable, financially irresponsible, or involved with dangerous associates. The children were described as traumatized and requiring specialized care that only the defendants could provide. These weren't legitimate psychiatric evaluations, they were criminal scripts designed to exploit family court judges' desire to protect vulnerable children. She displayed a chart showing 12 other cases where Harrison's network had used identical language and fabricated evidence to gain custody of children from recently widowed mothers. In every case, the children had significant inheritances that disappeared into the defendant's financial network within months of the custody transfer. The pattern was horrifying. I wasn't Harrison's only victim. I was part of a systematic operation that had destroyed dozens of families while enriching the conspirators through stolen inheritances and fraudulent legal fees. Dr. Amanda Foster's testimony revealed the medical side of the conspiracy. Under federal immunity, she admitted to creating false medical records for 23 children over 18 years, documenting psychological conditions that justified continued guardianship while making the children appear too unstable for reunification with their biological families. Harrison provided detailed instructions about what medical conditions needed to be documented, she testified, her voice barely audible with shame. He specified which psychiatric diagnoses would prevent family reunification and which would justify emergency custody transfers. I created comprehensive medical histories for children I'd never examined, documenting treatment for conditions they didn't have.
The most shocking revelation came from Sandra Walsh, who testified about the social services component of the conspiracy. As a supervisor in the county's child protection system, she'd systematically buried investigations that might have exposed the fraudulent placements while fast-tracking custody cases that benefited Harrison's organization. She admitted, "We created a pipeline. Wealthy widows with young children were identified through estate lawyers and insurance settlements. We'd manufacture child protection concerns that required immediate intervention, then present Harrison's network as emergency placement solutions. The biological mothers never had a chance to fight back because they were dealing with sudden grief, legal challenges, and false accusations simultaneously." The federal prosecutors had uncovered communication records showing that Harrison's network had generated over $14 million through their systematic exploitation of grieving families. They'd stolen inheritances, collected fraudulent guardianship fees, and even received government subsidies for providing care for children they'd kidnapped from loving homes. But the most personal moment of the trial came when Patricia Morrison presented evidence of Catherine Pemberton's 34-year search for me. The courtroom fell silent as she read excerpts from my mother's journals, documenting her desperate attempts to find her missing daughter.
July 15, 1995. Rebecca would be 13 today. I hired another private investigator, but he says Harrison's legal connections make it impossible to get information through official channels. I won't give up. She has to know that I never stopped looking for her. December 25, 2003. I drove through Millfield Creek today and saw a young woman who looked like Rebecca at the grocery store. I wanted to approach her, but what if I'm wrong? What if Harrison has convinced her that I abandoned her? How do I prove I'm her mother after 14 years of separation? March 10, 2020. I'm dying, and I still don't know if Rebecca understands that I loved her every day of her life. If there's any justice in this world, she'll find out the truth and know that her mother never gave up hope. The emotional impact on the jury was immediate and devastating. Several jurors were openly crying as they absorbed the depth of suffering Harrison's conspiracy had caused not just to the stolen children, but to the mothers who'd spent decades believing their children were lost forever. Detective Roy Martinez's conviction was particularly satisfying. Under federal investigation, his decades of corruption were fully exposed. He'd not only helped cover up Harrison's crimes, but had used his law enforcement connections to intimidate witnesses and suppress investigations. His testimony revealed that he'd been paid over $200,000 over 20 years to ensure that any law enforcement inquiries into suspicious guardianship cases were misdirected or abandoned. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours, guilty verdicts on all counts for all defendants. Judge Patricia Sullivan's sentencing hearing took place on a cold January morning, exactly 1 year after I'd laughed at Harrison's $1 inheritance and discovered the truth about my stolen life. The principal conspirators faced the harshest sentences. Jerome Walsh, who'd notarized fraudulent documents and helped launder stolen inheritance money, received 25 years in federal prison. Dr. Amanda Foster got 18 years for systematic medical fraud. Sandra Walsh was sentenced to 22 years for conspiracy and child endangerment. But the most meaningful moment came during the victim impact statements, when I finally had the opportunity to address the people who'd stolen 35 years of my life. Your Honor, these defendants didn't just commit financial fraud. They stole my identity, my family connections, and my mother's final decades. Catherine Pemberton died believing she'd failed to protect her daughter. I lived 35 years believing I was unwanted and alone. The psychological damage you've caused extends far beyond any financial calculation. I looked directly at the defendants as I continued. But your greatest failure was underestimating the power of a mother's love. Catherine never stopped searching for me, never stopped documenting the truth, and never believed that justice would eventually prevail. Your conspiracy was built on lies, but her love was built on truth. And truth ultimately proved stronger than all your deceptions. The civil asset forfeiture proceedings were equally thorough. Every property, every investment,
every asset that had been purchased with stolen inheritance money was liquidated and returned to the victims' families. My final recovery totaled $8.7 million, including the original inheritance plus damages and interest from the fraudulent guardianship scheme. But the real transformation happened after the legal proceedings ended. With the conspiracy exposed and the criminals imprisoned, I finally had the freedom to learn about the mother I'd been prevented from knowing. Patricia Morrison had preserved Catherine's personal effects, and spending time with my mother's belongings was like recovering lost pieces of my own identity. Her photo albums showed me my father Michael, a gentle man with kind eyes who'd worked in construction and died too young in an industrial accident. Her journals revealed a woman of strength and determination who'd built a successful business while never giving up hope of finding her stolen daughter. Most remarkably, Catherine had established a foundation dedicated to helping other parents locate missing children and navigate the legal complexities that could separate families. The Pemberton Foundation had assisted over 300 families in reunification efforts, using investigative resources and legal expertise to combat exactly the kind of systematic fraud I'd experienced. With my inheritance secured and the criminals imprisoned, I took over leadership of my mother's foundation. Our first major initiative was establishing a database of suspicious guardianship cases that could help identify patterns of exploitation before they could develop into long-term conspiracies. Working with federal investigators, we identified 17 additional cases where Harrison's network had separated children from their families using similar methods. In 8 of those cases, we were able to facilitate reunifications between adult children and their biological families who'd been told they were dead or had abandoned them. The most rewarding moment came 18 months after the trial, when I officiated the marriage of 2 people who'd been separated by Harrison's conspiracy when they were teenagers. Maria Santos and David Kim had both been taken from their families through fraudulent guardianship schemes, and they'd found each other while testifying in the federal case. Their wedding was held at the Pemberton Foundation headquarters with dozens of reunified families in attendance. Today, 5 years after that courthouse reading where I laughed at Harrison's $1 bequest and discovered the truth about my stolen life, I stand in the Denver office of the Pemberton Foundation, looking out at the Rocky Mountains my mother loved and working to ensure that no other family experiences the systematic theft of love and identity that defined my first 42 years.
The foundation now operates in 12 states, with legal teams specializing in fraudulent guardianship cases and investigative units that can trace suspicious custody patterns across jurisdictions. We've facilitated over 500 family reunifications and helped law enforcement prosecute 23 additional criminal organizations that specialized in exploiting grieving families. But the most important change is personal. For the first time in my life, I know exactly who I am and where I come from. I'm Catherine Rose Pemberton's daughter, raised with love for my first 7 years and searched for with desperate hope for the remaining 34 years of my mother's life. Harrison Ashford thought his $1 inheritance was the final insult in a lifetime of manipulation. Instead, it was the key that unlocked 35 years of lies and revealed the most important truth of my life, that I was never unwanted, never alone, and never forgotten. My mother's love proved stronger than their conspiracy, and that love continues to protect other families through the foundation that bears her name. The greatest inheritance Catherine left me wasn't money or property. It was the knowledge that some bonds are too strong for criminals to break, and that truth and persistence can overcome even the most sophisticated deceptions. Harrison raised me to be grateful and dependent. Instead, he created someone with the resources, determination, and legal expertise to destroy criminal organizations that prey on vulnerable families. The war for my identity was over, but the mission to protect other families was just beginning. And every reunification we facilitate is proof that Catherine Pemberton's love continues to change the world, one recovered child at a time.
Next up, 2 more stories chosen just for you. If you enjoyed this, you'll want to see what's coming. Tap to keep going.